Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times. I'm here with John Feffer, the Director of Foreign Policy and Focus, and also Global Just Transition. Hi, John. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. Well, we were going to talk about something a little bit more specific than a lot of people are hearing about climate change, hearing about energy transition, and these sound so big. And I asked you, well, maybe how about lithium? Looking at something specific, something that everyone would probably like to know about or should know about in some form or another because it's in the batteries. And the batteries are so important, of course, for storage and so forth. So I want to get into this a little bit and dig into it. You've written widely about everything from human rights to environment. You have a book called, was it Shadowlands?
Splinterlands.
Splinterlands,
Uh-huh.
Splinterlands, and uh, uh, and now minerals. So can we talk? Can you open up with that? Where where do we go with lithium? We start with mining. You have to have the brine and so
Mm,
on.
Sure. So, as you said, lithium is an extremely important uh, component of lithium-ion batteries. It's a relatively it's a simple uh, element, very high up on the early on in the periodic table. And it's relatively common, which is why it's so useful for these batteries. But it's also concentrated in certain areas of the world, and therefore, the countries that have lithium supplies are sitting on top of potential gold mines, so to speak. A lot of lithium, of course, is located in the lithium triangle, which is Argentina, Bolivia, Chile. Bolivia really hasn't developed its lithium to any great extent, but it has a lot under the ground. Um, Much of the lithium is located in arid regions of the world, and it also requires a lot of water for processing. And so therefore it is has potential environmental consequences. Obviously, for the communities that live around the lithium mines, the water that they depend upon is often diverted for the lithium production, for the extraction and production. Um, but the other kind of major issue at this point is China, of course, because China controls a great deal of the lithium in the world. It only mines something like it's between 10 and 15% of the world's supply of lithium, but it does, through its kind of global supply chain, control about 70% of lithium. And so that's the choke point. And it wouldn't be a choke point if, the United States, Europe, South Korea had good relations with China at this point. But there is considerable economic competition and concern that, if China has a kind of chokehold over lithium supply, it might decide, hey, we're not going to make this valuable commodity available. So there are two kind of approaches, and I'm kind of jumping up to geopolitics here, to this quote unquote problem of China. One is, of course, to find an alternative for lithium. And it's true that lithium ion batteries have become the standard for obviously electric vehicles and in other applications. But there's a race on right now to find alternatives to lithium ion batteries, batteries that rely on other minerals. And here too, of course, China is kind of well out in front in terms of the number of patents they've developed for alternatives. But basically, every major country is involved in R&D right now in finding these new batteries, and in some cases, batteries that still rely on lithium but less lithium. Okay, so that's one path, an alternative to lithium-ion batteries. The second path is basically to extract as much lithium from other places as possible. So really to invest in the extraction of lithium in obviously the ABC countries, the lithium triangle, to get the lithium out of the ground in Bolivia, but also to find new sources of lithium. And a number of countries have discovered, catches of lithium recently. And an interesting kind of development right now in the United States and Europe in particular has been the development of new legislation and regulation on the components in, for instance, electric vehicles. So here in the United States, for instance, if you want to sell a car in the United States and for that car to be subject to a tax rebate, in other words, for a manufacturer, like it could be a domestic manufacturer or a foreign producer like Hyundai, they have to ensure that the batteries, as well as other components in their EV, are sourced from countries other than China, basically. I mean, it might include some other countries along the lines, but China is the basic kind of target of this legislation. And it starts out at, I think it's a 25% or so that you have to ensure doesn't come from a country like China. And then it just rapidly gets higher and higher until it gets up to, I think, 80%. So that doesn't mean, obviously, that Hyundai has to do so. I mean, it can source its components from anywhere in the world. But if it wants to be able to be competitive in the American market, if it wants its EVs to be at a price point that is competitive with other EVs, then it's going to have to source its lithium, in this case, for its lithium-ion batteries from a country other than China. So there's kind of a scramble right now among the major EV manufacturing countries to make sure that they're sourcing their lithium from places other than China, or in some cases controlled by China. As I said, it's China itself only extracts a relatively small amount of the lithium in the world, but it does, through its global supply chain, control a rather large amount.
I like the way that you put these together. So, for example, lithium is like sodium. It's in the same area of the periodic table. We can look it up. It's alkali earth metal. But the way that this is, it has to be, it's taken out of the ground. That has to come from somewhere. So now we're into a political economy. And then comes the economics, transportation, logistics, and then processing and so forth. China is the locus of what you're talking about here. But you also say ABC countries, Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile. Mm-hmm. Bolivia is the Salar de Uyuni, salt flats. Okay, so walk us through how this works. WTO has laws in place that you have to source the material. Is this what we're talking about? Or
it's not the WTO. This is national legislation. So the United States has basically pushed through new regulations for, and this is something that is, we have our Inflation Reduction Act and all the environmental provisions in the IRA, and then there, of course, there's the whole regulatory framework that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, presides over. But then you have trade-related provisions, which the federal government can implement, and basically says that, if you want to have access to these tax rebates, as a company has access, or a consumer, basically, the consumer has access to the tax rebates, but the manufacturer designs the product in order for it to be compatible with these tax rebates. So that's national. Europe is now in the middle of its kind of critical Raw Materials Act discussions, and so this is part of its Green Deal, European Green Deal. It's Fit for 55 provisions. So it's somewhat more than national. Obviously, these are regional applying to all the members of the European Union. And it's somewhat different. I mean, the European Union is looking at ways of home sourcing, so finding these critical raw materials at home in Europe, rather than be dependent upon foreign sources. They're looking for urban mining, what they call, in other words, recycling.
Rematerialization.
Exactly. So, in some cases, this is not easy. I mean, it often can cost more to recycle than to actually, produce something new, which is a problem with the market if that's what's happening. But there are a number of new techniques coming online to make recycling easier, and recycling of solar panels and so forth, and obviously recycling of batteries as well. So those are two provisions. But other provisions for the Critical Raw Materials Act are about ensuring access to materials like lithium, to make sure that Europe can acquire them, competitively, so that the European car manufacturers are, they're not dependent on China, they're not dependent on very high prices from one supplier. So there's no surprise that Chile, Argentina have been hosting high-level delegations, trade and diplomatic delegations from South Korea, Europe, the United States, all of whom are going in there to do two things, basically. I mean, one is basically to buy stuff, the other is to set up trade deals to kind of set up the regulatory environment within which the trade takes place. And it's interesting. I mean, for instance, the EU set up a trade deal with Chile that, I mean, it does what usual, these FTAs, these free trade agreements generally do, which is to eliminate tariffs on goods that are going either way. But there's another interesting provision, and that is that it says that the Chilean government can't underprice a critical raw material like lithium for sale to domestic producers. And you might think, oh, well, why should it do that? I mean, it should be a market price, so the government shouldn't be tampering with the prices of these commodities. But Europe is concerned that the flow of something like lithium would slow to a trickle. In other words, if it's underpriced for domestic purchasers, let's say a Chilean car manufacturer gets access at a lower price to this lithium, then, well, of course, the lithium is going to stay in the country and it's not going to go to European purchasers. And so Europe is concerned about not having access to this lithium. But the other kind of side effect to that, which is an interesting side effect, and it's not an unintended consequence, I think it's an intended consequence, is that Chile won't be able to use a kind of industrial policy to jumpstart its own, clean energy manufacturing. It can do so, obviously, it can do so at the same prices that are available to any other purchaser of critical raw materials. But one kind of lever of industrial policy is to make the purchasing cheaper for domestic producers so that they have an advantage over external producers. So in theory, at least, a Chilean electric vehicle manufacturer would be able to produce, first a battery and then a car at a lower price than, say, a car coming in from Hyundai or a car coming in from Renault or Mercedes-Benz, and therefore would have an advantage. More products would be sold in the Chilean market, and that manufacturer would rise up and become a global competitor. And hooray, Chile would be able to rise on in the kind of global supply chain, no longer simply supplying raw materials, but actually supplying finished products in the global market. And obviously those are higher value added. Chile would get more of the profit from these products. And, it would make the jump in the same way that Korea made the jump from basically a producer of raw materials in the 1960s to the producer of ships and so on in the 1970s and 80s.
As you're telling the story, I'm thinking of Wealth of Nations and Adam Smith, because he told the United States to do exactly this, to produce their raw materials, and let Manchester. That the United States did exactly the opposite and built the Lowell factories and so forth and so on in Massachusetts. It's a well-known story. So you're saying that this is a kind of protectionism, right? So I could do protectionism with tariffs, or I could just lower the price or give it away internally, which is exactly protectionism along the same lines.
Essentially, yeah. I mean, you're protecting your infant industries,
Yes,
from
that's what it is.
global competition. And, I mean, Korea had to do the same. I mean, when it was building up a ship industry from zero,
Right.
Obviously, in order to do that, it had to somehow protect this infant industry from competition, from global competition. And it did so through kind of sophisticated government policy, and it got the prices wrong, as the economists say. And that meant the prices for the component parts of the shipbuilding industry, namely the steel that was coming from, and the entire steel, production in Korea was an infant industry at the beginning as well. But for Korea to succeed, it had to get the prices wrong. It had to defy the economists, the kind of classically trained economists. And what Europe is basically saying to Chile is, no, we're not. We're going to take away this option from you, and because we need this lithium. We need all these critical raw materials for our industries.
Let me argue back from the perspective of the capitalist. Then, in this case, if you're Chile, I say to you, I'm German. We have the industry, the highly sophisticated industry, the clean rooms for nanotechnology, all of this kind of stuff. We can produce this, we can process it and get it into the chips and into the battery, details and so forth. And you all have this process. So why don't we create some kind of partnership? But this is a no also, right? You can't do that. Can't do it. Okay.
Well, I mean, it's funny because partnership is the new word in Europe right now, and the European Union is looking for all sorts of clean energy partnerships with countries around the world. And it has started one with South Africa, for instance, and some of it is investment into clean energy technology domestically in South Africa. So the building out of South Africa's solar grid, for instance. So there are partnerships. The question is, what are the terms of those partnerships and how equal are they? And do they lock these countries into a kind of dependent relationship with the more sophisticated, economic partner? And I mean, what's interesting here is that it used to be that it would be trade relations that would govern this relationship between, the previous colonial power and the previous colonized power. But now we have, because of the importance of this clean energy transition, a new layer of relationships, a new layer of partnerships, and not as much scrutiny, perhaps, at the moment about those partnerships because they're new, because it's unclear what the terms are. But this will be the kind of the field of contestation over the next 5 to 10 years.
So Chile, like in your position, you would want to leverage and say, okay, you have the factories over there in Germany. We want royalties that come out of production from this raw material also? Is that what you would do?
Not necessarily royalties. I mean, royalties would be nice, but we want technology transfer. We want to be able to hold some of the intellectual property rights. Otherwise, we're going to be locked out of this process from now till God knows when. Of course, it does seem sensible from the point of view of comparative advantage for the countries that have, already invested in the technology, already have, industry already set up, for them to say, look, it doesn't make sense for you to invest all this money into basically reinventing the wheel. But if you're sitting in Santiago in Chile, basically every country's saying that to you across the spectrum of production. Germany says this about EV, China will say this about windmill production. Everybody's saying that, and then you're left with, well, what do we produce? We can't produce anything. We just have this raw material. We have this lithium. That's our only advantage. And the prospect of setting up a cartel, for instance, among lithium producers, just the way OPEC set up a cartel for oil producers, that's just not an option in today's trade environment. And so what if we don't have a cartel option, and we have problems with setting up an equitable trade relationship that involves the transfer of intellectual property rights, then we're basically out of luck. There's no way for us to rise up in the global supply chain, no way to make the jump from being a medium-sized economy to one of the world's largest and most powerful countries. Again, the process that South Korea has gone through. But what economists often say is, countries climb the ladder and then kick the ladder out from beneath themselves so that nobody else can climb up after them.
Ha-Joon Chang writes about this. Yeah. Okay, so what about, you mentioned China here. Let's say, they have their own lithium, but they go into the country and they say, we'll put in infrastructure and do technology transfer with you. And that's a lot different than, say, the British East India Company, which you really can't have. These are antiquated systems, right? Even like the cartel, OPEC, all of that's antiquated. So this new model that you see with China, there probably is some good to it, but I think a lot of it's just this pragmatic, status kind of resource grab, as you call it. Does that work, or will it work? Is that the new model? What do you think?
The Chinese model, the Belt and Road Initiative model.
It's kind of put in the infrastructure, and then you get to bid on the natural resource, like lithium or something.
Well, China is definitely developing across the board a model that can compete with the current kind of globalization model. I mean, it's interesting because China obviously is engaged in the same game as everybody else. And so it's playing on that chessboard, if you will, but at the same time, it's setting up its own chessboard with its own
another one.
Exactly. So it's setting up its own version of the World Bank. It's setting up its own regional bank. It's BRICS Bank. It has set up its own web of relationships through Belt and Road Initiative. I'm not so sure it's that different from the conventional globalization model that is centered in Washington, say, or in Brussels. It just happens to be centered in Beijing. It has a different center. I don't know if the model itself is all that different. China invests a lot in the infrastructure. I don't necessarily see a lot of technology sharing that goes on as part of that relationship. Some of it is same old. China going in and setting up roads, setting up rail, setting up ports, setting up air terminals in Africa, for instance, all of which is designed to facilitate the transfer of resources to China or perhaps to China's trade partners. But in any case, it's China is essentially reproducing, the old 19th century model of resource extraction. And it's doing so within basically the same political model. So, the argument has been that, the West requires all sorts of human rights contingencies, et cetera, as part of its relationship with countries in Africa or in Asia. And China doesn't care. I mean, China will work with anybody. It'll work with a country that is effectively committing genocide upon its population. It doesn't really care that much as long as it gets what it needs. And so that's more of a, say, 19th century political model within which China is operating. And unfortunately, that confers a comparative advantage upon China, because the United States have basically, for political reasons, declared no access zones in parts of the world. Or, obviously, some U.S. corporations defy, the U.S. government's.
Well, I mean, speaking of the Southern Cone, I mean that what was done there was far beyond anything that China's done, and also Iraq, which is still going on. So this kind of a, what do you call it, resource grab model, or this kind of brutal, just get in like Central, maybe like Congo, or is it Congo or Central Africa, where it's just like, corporate free for all, this kind of thing. That's what you're seeing. Yeah.
I mean, so for instance, Congo, it's not lithium, but cobalt in this case, is, the country is, basically been in a war environment for decades. And a variety of different corporations have gone in there to secure access to cobalt. So yeah, I mean, the United States, Europe, they have on the books, at least, a variety of rules and regulations governing corporate conduct. Whether those corporations, in fact, obey those rules and regulations or find all sorts of workarounds. So effectively, depending on the part of the world, you'll find that the United States and China are often, basically at the same level in terms of the restrictions they put on resource extraction.
Looking at some positivity with lithium, is that going to do it for batteries? Or, I heard you mention that there has to be a combination. Can you talk a little bit about this? What direction? What does the futurist kind of look in and see in here?
Well, the big challenge, of course, for clean energy is storage, and the transfer of that electricity, or that transfer of that energy from one place to another. It's what has made solar energy and wind power so challenging, and why these new hydrogen, blue hydrogen, gray hydrogen, green hydrogen options so attractive, because this is a way of turning clean energy, or in some cases, if we're talking about it, sometimes the hydrogen comes from fossil fuels, but it's a way of basically coming up with a product that can be transferred from one place to another. So for instance, you set up a solar farm in Morocco. How do you get that energy to Europe? Because Europe, has the demand. Because generally speaking, you're going to have that solar energy available to Moroccans, which is good, but Europe wants to make sure that it can get a piece of the pie, so to speak. So storage is still the big question for clean energy, and it's really the primary obstacle between moving from fossil fuels to clean energy. Now, fossil fuels have other advantages over clean energy, such as high temperature, ability to, for instance, in steel production, to provide the high temperatures necessary for steel production, which electricity simply can't do at this point. But storage is still the kind of major issue. And then to find cheaper ways of creating batteries and battery storage. So there, again, there's all sorts of kind of stuff at the edges in which people are using sodium. You mentioned sodium. So sodium would be great. You use sodium for instead of lithium in a battery. sodium is far more abundant in the world, and suddenly, no country is going to have a monopoly over sodium. You can get sodium anywhere.
I don't know. We may have to have Gandhi or the Salt March again to do this.
Right. Or
But let me
water.
ask you,
That's another possibility.
or water.
Yeah.
If you have something there in northern Africa, do they run like cables under the Strait of Gibraltar or that part to get energy in, or do they have ships that have batteries on them? How do they do this? They charge the ship with a battery, and that goes like, how does this work?
I honestly don't know. I mean,
I wondered about
we're at the just the beginning of this, where they're just starting to fund the infrastructure in Northern Africa. Europe, for the most part, right now, obviously with the war going on in Ukraine, they had to find some alternatives for Russian natural gas. And they have done so primarily by finding natural gas elsewhere, in the Gulf states, for instance, or from the United States, or falling back on some of their older resources like coal, unfortunately. But there also has been, over the last year, tremendous investments into clean energy in Europe, in Latin America, in the United States, far more than would have probably taken place if the war hadn't broken out. So this is, if you like, the silver lining of the current conflict in Ukraine. But it means that this kind of investment into for Europe, especially, into clean energy technology in Northern Africa, we're just at the beginning. And as I said, hydrogen has become one of the kind of the miracles for the transfer of energy that's produced by clean energy that's transferable, and then it presumably goes by tanker from Africa to Europe.
So that would eliminate the need for lithium if you have hydrogen, or
oh well, no, hydrogen would you'd still need the lithium for the components for your solar panels. You would need your anything that required a lithium ion battery, but the hydrogen is basically just a kind of a middleman, if you will. It can take, you can put the energy that's produced by anything. I mean, that's why there are all these varieties of hydrogen: green hydrogen, brown hydrogen, blue hydrogen, all of which refer to the sources of energy that go into these forms of hydrogen. And then you bring the hydrogen over, and it's effectively a kind of a storage for the energy you've produced. But again, this too is still we're at the beginning stages. There's a lot of new hydrogen infrastructure going in South Africa, for instance, which requires upgrading of ports and new technologies at the point of energy production.
Sounds complicated, and some of these new things I hadn't heard of. So looking into the future, we've got to have energy storage. We've got to have a way to store it and to transport it, basically, right? And the current system obviously isn't working. What is it going to take? Mass movements, investment, law, political economy, all that. Let's end on what can be done here from the grassroots on up into policy.
Yeah. Well, the priority, the urgent matter before us right now is for the world to make a transition to clean energy as quickly as possible. Obviously, July 4th was the hottest day in the world in 120,000 years, and that's pretty significant. And that's, we will see more to come. We weren't even around. That was Neanderthal time.
We were around, but we just began to talk, I think, or something like that, right? Linguistically,
so it's obviously that's going to just be our future heading forward, unless we do a radical transformation of our entire industrial agricultural infrastructure, which will be dependent on new technologies around clean energy. Okay, so we all know that. The question is, first of all, how quickly it can happen and how equitably it can happen. So is this going to be a transition that takes 100 years, or is this a transition that's going to take 25 years when, according to the Paris Agreement, by 2050, we're all carbon neutral? So that's the first question. And then the second question, of course, is equitability. And is this going to be a transition that's largely something the North enjoys? In other words, Europe becomes entirely carbon neutral. You go there, the air is clean, and it's solar panels everywhere, not a single combustion vehicle in sight. Everything's electrified. But behind that, in the global South, is all of the mining operations required to provide the component parts for this clean energy technology and infrastructure in Europe, as well as all of the industries and agriculture that is carbon heavy, that's been basically offloaded from Europe into the global South. And the products come back, but the carbon content is in some sense hidden. Now, we could talk about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and how that's supposed to reveal the carbon content of stuff that comes into Europe. But in any case, the question is, are we going to have a clean North and a dirty South? And that's going to be the green colonialism of the future. And going to your question, well, how do we ensure that this is both rapid and equitable? Well, rapid and equitable will require kind of public mass movements. There's no question about it, because, arrayed on the other side are the status quo interests of, big corporations that are wedded to the kind of business as usual, not willing to go quickly and not willing to go as radically as necessary. And governments that are wedded to those industries, either as a result of direct corruption or what we consider just the campaign financing, which is kind of indirect corruption.
Just have a super PAC and then we can do.
Exactly. So there's significant, powerful interests that even if they say they want a clean energy transition, are still standing in the way of both a fast transition and an equitable transition. So it's going to require mass movements that link hands between the North and the South. I mean, there's no question that this will require the kind of cooperation we saw with the end of colonialism in the 1950s and 1960s, in which you did have groups in Europe and primarily Europe that joined hands with independence movements in Africa and Asia, primarily. But in this case, we're going to see different kinds of partnerships, if you will, but partnerships between environmental organizations, economic justice organizations, and so forth, between North and South, that coordinate to ensure that the North is not allowed to have its Green New Deals and Green Deals without technology transfer, addressing climate debt and reparations, loss and damage, the full panoply of mechanisms that are required to ensure that we have a global just transition and not just a just transition in the North.
I've been speaking with John Feffer, the Director of Global Just Transition, which is what he ended up with there, and also Director of Foreign Policy and Focus. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you for having me on the show.